Okay, so we're back. So we're on our come together mix, and this is going to be about the vocal treatment. So let's look at what I did on the vocal treatment first. So here we got the main lead vocal, which is a little compression. Let's just look at how much compression. And you see I did a slow attack, fast release. I actually boosted it a little here on the output, just because I could have done it on the main fader here, but I did it on the plugin just force of habit. I guess it was a tweak that I made. Secondly, here's the filtering that I did on the vocal. And I did this so that I could achieve the same sort of filtered sound that is in the original Beatles mix. You see I filtered low pass at 7.4 kilohertz, high pass at about 400 kilohertz. And then in the middle here, I didn't do any sort of extra pushing up of frequencies. I just basically limited the high frequency and low frequency, and this gives you sort of that telephone voice sound. And I also did a little extra gain here as well, probably a final tweak when I was listening back. Sometimes it's easier than changing the fader is to just tweak a little here, but you have to be very careful because the chain of plugins go from left to right or top to bottom when you're looking at the other page, the mix page instead of the edit page. And if you bump it up too much here, it can have a tendency to distort the input of this plugin, the next plugin in the chain. Next, I used a little delay. This is about 160 milliseconds. I use 153.51. That's not critical. You can't hear the difference between that and 160. I set the mix at about 17% and a little tiny bit of feedback. This is sort of the old school delay that the Beatles used a lot. Elvis Presley used a lot on his vocals for the old rockabilly 50s vocal sound, and basically it was set up because they only had a tape machine to create a delay with. Back in the old days, they didn't have plugins, obviously, and they'd use the distance and the tape speed at 15 inches per second between the record head and the playback head for the delay, which happened to be about 160 milliseconds. So when you set up and use that delay time, you can kind of recreate that classic sound. Lastly, so you see here I put a special delay only on the vocal. It's not as an auxiliary. Secondly, we've got a little bit of vocal plate going on. Bus 1 and 2 send from the vocal track. And the vocals are sending. Let's look at the harmony vocal next. Harmony vocal is basically set up the same way. This time I didn't add as much on the output, which really is a bit of sort of bad mix technique. I try to leave the ins and the outs at zeros, but a dB here and there is not a big deal. But you got to be careful, as I said, about distorting the input of the next plugin in the chain. Same basic filtering, except not quite as severe on the low frequency. Okay, and that's the harmony vocal. This time, no delay on it, and I've got a little vocal plate as well. So this is what it sounds like together with the lead vocal. Okay, that gives you a bit of an idea of how the vocals all sit. Next, let's go to the stereo bus, and we'll leave everybody in the mix, and we'll see how much we're doing with each one of these plugins so that you can get sort of an idea. And let's actually go to one of the more loud spots in the mix. So you can see my C4 is from 250 to about 4K. In the center band is the only thing I'm touching, and that's the only thing I'm basically doing a little compression out of, just so that the vocals sit in a little better in the mix, and so that the frequency spectrum in the final outcome has a little more relative top and bottom than mid-range. Let me actually leave that up, and I'll show you on the spectrum analyzer what I'm actually compressing. So here on the right is the spectrum analyzer. Let's leave that up, and let's take a look by soloing this C4 as to what frequencies are actually being affected here in the mix. So you see it's a host of mid-range frequencies. Host of mid-range frequencies being affected. Let's put all of it back together, and you can see what the overall spectrum looks like. You see there's a bit of a peak at 500 here, and the compressor is helping to hold that in. If it wasn't there, it may be as loud as the 60 cycle, but generally speaking, you want the spectrum to look a little like this, where 60 cycle is the loudest, starts falling off fairly rapidly. By 30 or 15, it's down at least 10 or 20 decibels, and from the peak at 60, and then the mid-range frequency is generally in this neighborhood, but certainly the high frequencies start rolling off here at 8 to 16K, but fairly flat in this direction. So minus 20 is really your center line, and the bottom end pops up here. And some of the vocals, if we go over the vocal spots, you'll see are in the mid-range as well. Let's do that. So you see here, it filled out some of the 1K and 2K area as well. So that's a really nice basic spectrum to look at, and that's basically how it should look. Let's look next. Let's unsolo this, and let's look next at the EQ that I'm using. So what I'm doing here is I am starting to notch out a little bit of about 160 cycles, because it got a little mid-rangey in there, which is right in this region here on the spectrum analyzer. And I'm adding a little 8.2K, so up in here I'm adding a little bit of high frequency to sort of help balance this out. Otherwise it would be a lot of lower mid-range and less high frequency. So I'm gently controlling it here with the C4, and then also fine-tuning it with the EQ. Now generally I'll put a compressor before an EQ, but on the master bus I can't do that, because the L2 will bring up the level so loud it will distort everything below it. So I need to put the L2 after I make my fine-tuning adjustments. And here we go with the L2. It's looking like this. I pulled it down a little past -6 is where I start generally, and I did that so that I can get the correct level in terms of my peak versus RMS values. So let's take a look. Here's my RMS value. -9, looking good. Okay, let's take it and go to a louder spot. See the L2 and what it does? Here, it's going down it's pretty compressed. So you got to watch it not to overdo it. I've been pretty much on the edge of doing it as much as you can. You see how the cymbals start popping out a little bit? If I bypass it, you'll see the difference in spectrum and the difference in level. Now unbypass. So you see the difference there. It's severe. And this is a very important compressor to use on the stereo bus to get up to a level that's a reasonable level for, or close to a pre-mastered level. This is not what I'd do if I was doing a final mix. I would use the L2 and the stuff I'm using on the stereo bus as a precursor to final mastering so I can hear how it will sound. Then when I get my final mix, I would bypass the L2 and the Maxim and I would go ahead and run my mix, and then I'd send it off to mastering, or I'd do it myself, import it into a new session, add an L2 and a Maxim and a spectrum analyzer and a C4, and really fine-tune it again so that I don't do too much in one phase. But for quick mixing and so that I understand basically how the mastered final product will be, I'll use the L2 on the stereo bus. And the Maxim here is next. Let's take a look at what it's doing. You can see over here that it's barely touching it. Maybe a half a dB, but very little. And I'm basically controlling the ceiling so I don't go into the red. Now, if I had my druthers and I was going to redo this mix, I may take and choose to lighten up this L2, lighten up the L2 just a little bit. Sorry, the music is conflicting with what I'm saying. Let me show you what it is. And you see the RMS value didn't change a whole lot. It actually sounds pretty good. It's a little more subtle, but you hear the difference, I believe. Maybe on the video you can't, but I'll describe the difference. The difference is that it feels a little less compressy and it feels a little more dynamic, and actually feels a little better to do this. I probably should have done this, but as I said, you can always second guess. Maybe I haven't said it, but I'll say it once now, and I'm sure I'll say it many, many times, that you can second guess yourself 100 ways, but the fact is that at some point you make a decision and you let it go. And that's what I did. Looking back at this now with fresh ears, I may have changed it just slightly to more this kind of a compression on the stereo bus. Over-compressing is an obvious thing. The mix gets very splatty and very high-end, but doing the right amount, it sounds natural, and it sounds like it has a little bit of dynamics that are natural, and allows the mix to breathe a little more. Okay, so that's what I did. I'm going to leave it as a little less compression there. And I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and save it like this, and I'm going to flip pages so you can take a look at my mix page. So that was the edit page. Okay, so can't seem to move the spectrum analyzer. Of course, I like to have it there anyway, so I can see what's going on. So let's take a look at my kick drum pannings. You can take a look at my pannings. You can take a look at my bus sends. You can take a look at my my plugins. So now, one thing that I want to point out, which makes mixing a lot easier, is if you take your bus sends and you put your bus 1 and 2s on the bottom, 3s and 4s on the next one, 5s and 6, and so on, and you build it like that. And generally, the signal will go from top to bottom here when you are able to look at your plugins on the mix page. So the signal flow goes to the compressor and then the EQ, and that's basically how I did it. Now on the toms, I put the R bass and then a compressor. So I'm sorry, that's an EQ. So that's a 6-band EQ. A D2 is an EQ. So the D3 is the compressor. So and then I've got some delays, these specialized delays that we talked about on the hand clamp and the shoot beat part. So you can see some of my panning directions here, right? And you can also see the grayed out solo, that because I solo safed in the beginning, so that when I solo any individual element, everything else mutes except all of the effects. so that I can hear my effects in place and see how much I have on each element. Okay? So here's my master bus. And I think that that's a pretty clear understanding of what I do with this mix. And if there's anything else I can show you, I'd be happy to do that in class. And if this is just going to be watched online, then you can always email me. All right, I think that that's pretty clear, fairly straightforward mix. They'll get more complicated as we go along. Hope that was helpful.